You have a homework assignment due on Sunday the 27th. That's homework number 3. Today's class, we're covering the last of those things that's included on the assignment. Of course, if you want to finish the assignment early, you could always just look in the book and learn the stuff in there that we're going to be talking about. So you don't always have to wait until, and also many of the problems we've already solved previously. So the point is, hopefully you get an early start on the assignment, get it finished before you go on the break, and then you can just forget about it. Don't have to worry about anything other than relaxing. The homework assignment has come back from the grader. If you didn't pick that up, you can get it after class. The grader made some requests. So please include a simple cover page with your homework assignments. It makes it easier for the grader to keep everything straight. Also, sometimes if you're ripping paper out of a notebook, you know how it can have the jagged pieces of paper. Please remove that from the page as well. And staple your work together. Don't use a paper clip, because in all of the shuffling, the paper clip can be lost, and then your assignment pages can be lost. I won't be posting our homework solutions online, and the main reason for that is that I may reuse some of the questions next semester when I teach the class again. And since you guys had to suffer through the assignment without having the solution in advance, I think it's only fair that next semester the students will have the same experience. So I'm not going to post the solutions online. One last thing is, I was at the Australian school yesterday. There was like an open house for my kids, and the headmaster there made a really interesting point about the difference between homework and studying. When you hear those two words, what do you think is the difference between homework versus studying? Any thoughts? Okay, which one is practice? Okay, you think of homework as practice. I think that's definitely part of it. Any other ideas on the difference between homework and studying?
Homework is graded assessment.
Right.
Studying is not graded.
Excellent. Right. The effect will impact your grade, but you're not going to turn in your studying for a score. It's sort of self-motivation. Homework is something the teacher assigns to you. So in studying, you analyze yourself, and you think, what do I need to learn better? And you find some way that works for you to learn whatever you think is the weak point right now. Homework is assigned by the instructor to everyone. Has the same assignment, but maybe you need some special work in a certain area. So the point is that in the class, if you really want to do well, if you want an A grade or a B grade, you need to have both. You need to complete the homework, obviously, because it's a graded exercise, but the only way to really know the material is to study it on your own, above and beyond just the simple homeworks that you're going to be solving. And that's the point that they made yesterday at the Australian International School. I thought it was a pretty good point. We're going to be talking about something called minimum acceptable rate of return today, beginning with this illustration. We're going to spend a few minutes on this figure because it's an important one. This is just for one certain company, and it's telling a story about this company. We're going to start with the blue line. And the blue line, you can see from the label here, it says approximate cost of capital obtained. So the blue line is the money the company borrowed. So along the x-axis here, you can see it says cumulative investment amount in millions. So if this company is borrowing money from the bank $1 million, how much does it cost the company to borrow $1 million from the bank? On the y-axis, it says the interest rate. What interest rate do they pay to borrow $1 million? About 10%. The blue line is showing 10% to borrow $1 million. What about $2 million? Maybe just a little bit more. You can tell that the curve, it went up a little, but still close to 10%. And so on. So they can borrow money, and here it's showing their interest rate that they have to pay. What about to borrow $6 million? Looks like to borrow $6 million, now they're paying 15%. Why is the bank charging them 15% to borrow $6 million when it used to only be 10%? It's higher risk. What do you mean by that? You're right, but what do you mean?
Well, they're going to take higher risk. They want a better outcome for their...
Exactly. Yeah, the bank is starting to get a little nervous. The bank will say, well, I'll give you $1 million because I trust your company. It has many good projects. It's not a big risk, so 10% is what I want. But then when you're asking the bank for $6 million, suddenly they start to get a little bit more nervous. They see it as a higher risk because maybe $6 million is a lot compared to the work you've done in the past. And so they require a greater reward, just as he said. So the cost of borrowing is increasing the more and more this company wants to borrow. So that's the first part of the story. Sometimes in exams, I provide a picture and I want you to tell me the story. I'd say, explain this figure. And so hopefully if I gave you this figure, the first part of your explanation would be the increasing cost of borrowing as the amount that's borrowed goes up. The percentage gets larger. So the second part of the story that this figure is telling is what the company spends the money on that they've just borrowed. You know, they had to go to the bank to borrow money, so what are they going to do with it? You can see that there's labels here, A, B, C. All of those letters refer to some kind of a project that the company has in mind. Maybe project A is to modernize the computer system. And if they want to modernize the computer system, it looks like it maybe costs around $600,000 approximately. And if they spend that money, then the money they spent is going to yield a 35% rate of return. That means for every $100 they spend, they're getting back $135 in return. So 35% return just on that one project. So should they do project A? If they get 35% return and they only had to pay 10% to the bank to borrow the money in order to fund project A, should they do it? Absolutely. If you can go somewhere and borrow money and spend that money to generate a higher rate of return, do the project. And so project A is a thumbs up. Yes, that's a good project. What about project B? What's the story there? Well, it costs a little more money, whatever it is. Maybe project B is updating delivery vehicles so that they can have faster service. It doesn't yield as high a return. So does that mean we should only do project A? Because project B is lower than project A. Why should we do project B? Why? We're still making money. You're not going to turn away money, right? You're still making more than it costs to borrow. So the rule is do every project you can where the cost of borrowing is lower than the rate of return. So when does that finish for this company? Project F and project G. Why does it say reject F, reject G? Right, so on F, the rate of return and the cost of borrowing is the same. So essentially, that means you're doing the project, you're not losing money, but you're also not getting money. So why bother with project F? And then project G is even worse. What's the problem with project G? You're actively losing money. You've borrowed so much money from the bank that now they're getting really nervous and the cost of borrowing is larger than the rate of return. And so here, MARR stands for minimum acceptable rate of return. For this situation, this particular company, if you look at the figure, for them the minimum is 16% because that is where they have to draw the line of no more projects. It has to be at least greater than 16%. Now, it could be different for them, though. What if project A through E wasn't available? What if they wanted to do those projects, but the government said no to all of them? They couldn't get the permits, A through E. So now the only choice they have is F and G. Should they do those two projects if those are their only two choices? Actually, they should because it moves to the left, and so now their cost of borrowing is back down to 10%. And so if F and G are the only projects that they have in mind, the total amount looks like about 1.5 million. So how much does it cost them to borrow 1.5 million? Only 10%. So 10% is larger than 10% is less than 16 and 14. So if F and G are the only option, then they're both acceptable. But if this is all of the projects, then F and G would be unacceptable. So you have to sort of look at it carefully, because a project that looks good initially, when you're not considering all the other choices, can become less attractive if your borrowing costs went up so high.
Can I do it the other way? Like, make G at the beginning, like, A at the end?
Well, no, you should always choose the most profitable projects first. Yeah. Yeah, it's just, that's a good question, because you're thinking, you know, A would be higher than the borrowing cost, right? But just rearranging the order of the figure wouldn't change the fact that if you did all of them, some of the projects are returning less than the cost of your borrowing. Yeah. So the answer is no. You should always order them like this. Yeah.
Do you actually get to look at such figures when considering the options starting out businesses?
What's that?
Do you actually get to look at such figures?
You could make one. You know, like if you're starting a company, no one else is going to give this figure to you. But you could go to a bunch of banks and find out, you could make this own curve. You could get a point, a point, a point, and you could draw the line that connects them. And then you could think about your project and make estimates. You know, no one will make a guarantee of how much rate of return. And so these are, remember, we've talked about before how you always have to keep the difference between a point estimate and a range estimate in mind. But yeah. Uh-huh.
Is it better to flip the diagram because like all companies will
No.
do
It's an illusion. If you flip it, it makes you think like that F and G are good, but still, it's just an illusion if you flip it. It's still going to be a waste of money. Even if you rearrange the figure in the other way, I understand that it will be A and B would be above the line, but trust me, it would still be, you're losing money on the projects that return the least.
You can think of it as not a graph, but like think of how much money you will be borrowing.
Yeah.
And then think of the numbers. So you're going to be paying 16% and you're not getting those 16% of the project.
Yeah.
Because you're going to be borrowing all the money.
Yeah, you will be borrowing all the money. Okay, so what is this MARR, minimum attractive rate of return? Usually the management of a company will make a decision on what their minimum return is. It's like a policy. And they'll tell everyone, we don't want any projects that pay us less than something percent. And a big part of that figure, whatever they choose, is how much it costs to borrow money. And so we've introduced a term here, the weighted average cost of capital. That means if you're borrowing some money from one bank, some money from another bank, issuing bonds, having stocks, whatever way you're raising money, you can average it together, and that weighted average cost of capital should never be higher than the rate of return on your projects. You should always get more from your project than you're paying to borrow the money. And that's the illustration we saw in the previous figure. The next idea is that what you choose for the minimum acceptable rate of return partly depends on how many projects you have available. Remember we were talking about what if F and G are the only projects available? Well, you'd do them if you had limited options. But if you are in a company that has many, many ideas and lots of options available, maybe your standards are a bit more high on the rate of return. So Google, for instance, it's a big company with a lot of growth and a lot of really hardworking, intelligent people for it. So probably they have a high MARR because they have a lot of projects available. Every one of their engineers has some pet project they want to do. And so you have to have something really amazing to get it funded. Whereas a grocery store, supermarkets are notorious for having a low rate of return. it's very difficult to differentiate one supermarket from another. And so supermarkets, even if they have a project that's just marginally profitable, then most of the time they'll do that just because it's very hard to have a high-yielding project with a supermarket. One term we're going to introduce today is the idea of opportunity cost. And one of the things you need to keep in mind is that if you spend $1 on one project, you can't spend that same dollar on another one. And so there may be a limited number of options available to you, and you should always pick the option that is the best. So if you're in the university right now, the opportunity cost is you could have been sleeping in today. Or if you think more long-term, what's the opportunity cost of coming to the university for 4 years? You could have been working. What's the second best option during the period that you were here? You could have been working. And so opportunity cost, there's a numeric definition for it that we'll look at in a minute. But qualitatively speaking, what you need to think about is what was the second best choice? The minimum return is partly determined by how risky projects are perceived to be and how much work it takes to administer them. And finally, private companies usually have a higher minimum return that they require than, say, a municipality. Because private companies, number one, have higher borrowing costs, and they're trying to generate a profit. Whereas a municipality or a hospital or a public government, they don't really have the same pressure to generate a profit that an organization with shareholders does. There's two kinds of financing, broadly speaking, and the book talks about how the first kind is called equity financing. And equity financing means that the people who have an ownership stake in the company are providing the funds. So if a company issues stock and you buy the stock in, say, Facebook, if you own 100 shares of Facebook, that means you actually own part of the company. If there are 1 million shares available and you have 100, then that's a very small fraction of the company that you own. But what you own when you own those stock shares is you own, you're entitled to a portion of the future earnings that the company is making. The other kind of financing is debt. And with debt financing, you're investing in a company, but you don't actually own a piece of it. You're just providing them with a certain amount of money. They promise to pay it back with interest, but then that's the end. You don't own a piece of the company forever when you make a loan. So the main difference between equity financing and debt financing is that in equity financing, you're actually getting a piece of the company by providing the funds. Usually, debt financing is considered a safer investment because debt, like a bond, for example, is secured by collateral, whereas stocks are a little more risky because it's not secured necessarily with collateral. All you have is you have the promise of a fraction of their future earnings. Whether you're getting the money from equity or debt, this rule always has to be honored, that your rate of return should always be greater than the minimum that the policy has been set by the executives. Every project that is economically justified will be greater than the minimum acceptable rate of return or equal to it. And the weighted average cost of capital always has to be exceeded. Otherwise, you don't do the project. Otherwise, it's not economically justified. It's unjustified. If it costs more to borrow than you receive in return. Yes? Sure. That is how much it costs you to get the money. Remember in the first figure we were looking at this blue line? So the weighted average cost of capital is how much it costs for you to get the money from the bank, or if you're issuing stock, or if you're taking a loan or bonds, whatever it is, the weighted average cost of capital is you make an average of all of the sources of your money for that project. Yes? Rate of return. ROR is the rate of return for a project. Yes?
What if you don't borrow your money? What if
Your own money.
you just account for inflation, for example?
That's part of it. You account for what else you could have been doing with the money. So you could have taken your money and you could put it in the bank. And the bank is paying you 2%. So you won't take any other project that doesn't pay at least 2%. Or you could have taken that money and you could have bought a bond. Like a company is issuing a bond, so maybe that bond was 5%, and it's a very safe investment. So now you're thinking, what's my second best option? You look at all of the options you have, and if it's your own money, then you don't want to choose any project that is returning less than your second best choice. So that ties right into opportunity cost. It's the value of the second best option. So today, your second best option was to sleep longer, right, instead of coming to class. So you're paying a cost by being here. It's more than just the tuition. You're also paying the cost of what else you could have been doing with your time. That's one way to think about it. The textbook says that opportunity cost is the largest rate of return of all the projects that are not accepted due to a lack of capital funds. So that seems complicated. Let's look at an example. Let's say there's two projects, Project A and Project B. Project A will give you 13%. Project B will give you 15%. Both of them are good because both of them are larger than the MARR. But unfortunately, you can only do one of those two projects. So which one are you going to do? You're going to do Project B because it gives you a higher rate of return. So according to this definition, the largest rate of return of projects not accepted. So we didn't do Project A, so our opportunity cost is 13%, according to that definition. So we have to pay 13% opportunity cost. I mean, it's not actually money you have to get out and pay with your wallet, but if you had more money available, you would have got that project. So it's a pity that we were limited, that we could only do one. All right. Now, we're not going to have time, most likely, to finish all of the in-class exercise. We only have 9 minutes, but that's okay. I'd like you to look over the first page, and at the very least, you should be able to finish problem 1 and 2. I'm going to collect it no matter how much you actually finish on the in-class exercise. I'll collect it today, and then we're going to continue it when we get back together on Sunday after Eid break. Okay, before we finish for today, let's look at the answer for the first couple of problems here. The opportunity cost of coming to university is that you could have gotten a job. And so the opportunity cost is all of the money that you would have earned if you'd been working at a job instead of here. But then there's an opportunity cost of that as well, because if you're working instead of at the university, then long term the earnings would be lower. Okay, problem 2 asks you, for your company being AA rated, here on the table it's showing how much interest you have to pay in order to take out money for those durations. And this is data that I got online yesterday. This is the actual corporate interest rates averaged. So if your company is going to borrow money for 5 years and it's going to get 9% return on that project, 9% is more than the 2.22% you're going to pay to borrow the money. So yes, you should do Project A. Project B is a no because it's only returning 1% and the cost of borrowing that money is 1.32%. So the expense is larger than the return. So don't do that project, and so on. All right. We are out of time for today. Let's take a look at these announcements one more time before you finish for the long break. Homework 3 is due at the beginning of class on Sunday the 27th. And then we're going to continue this in-class exercise, but I want to get it from you, so please set it in the chair and I'll bring it back to class when we get together on Saturday.